I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue, clouds of white, bright, blessed days, dark, sacred nights. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colours of a rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, "How do you do?" They're really saying, "I love you." I hear babies cry. I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Quite simply wonderful.
Allora, benvenuti a tutti e grazie a queste magnifiche, mutevoli immagini che abbiamo scelto, una danza tra umano, cosmo e infinito, vorremmo con voi iniziare a disporci in un ritmo diverso dal nostro quotidiano, frettoloso e troppo spesso indifferente, così da allenarci a quell'arte dell'ascolto che possa aiutarci in questo nuovo passo che stiamo insieme compiendo, dicendo no alla condizione di individuo mutilato e separato, facilmente utilizzabile come prodotto e numero senza qualità, ritornando invece ad essere quello che siamo, quello che abbiamo visto, un dinamismo della realtà che danza nel ritmo dell'essere. E allora, benvenuti a voi tutti, a nome di Fondazione Arbor, che ha, come dire, sostenuto tutto quello che succederà, a nome della comunità di ricerca Colligita Fragmenta di Bergamo e di Spazio Stuno 13 di Milano, e anche da questo luogo sempre magico che è il Teatro Filodrammatici, e naturalmente da me, che tenterò in questi giorni di essere il nastro di un bellissimo mazzo di fiori che siete voi e di tenere in fila le fila dei molti momenti di questo convegno, a cui abbiamo dato nome L'Economista Mistico, titolo provocatorio in quanto speriamo stimolante e capace di parole non vane che sappiano nuovamente incuriosirci e magari stupirci per porci delle domande. Arte questa in via di estinzione. Vorremmo in questi giorni sapere e potere mettere in pratica l'arte del dialogo, quella capacità umana oggi urgente ed imprescindibile di cui Raymond Panikkar, ideale guida di questo nostro convegno, è stato fertile interprete, per cercare insieme non risposte definitive, non schemi o modelli alternativi a qualcosa di esistente, ma nuove possibilità umane e creative, rischiando una parola che sappia divenire armonia nella relazione trinitaria che il nostro essere ha con il cosmo e con il mistero che ci circonda e ci sorpassa. Ho trovato una frase ieri sera bellissima di Ermete Trismegisto che dice: esiste un rancore nell'umano che disprezza l'immortalità e ci impedisce di riconoscere quanto di divino esiste in noi. Ecco, questo convegno vuole essere un momento di gioco e di studio, qualità dello spirito, e dove molti amici hanno aderito con gioia e ringrazio. Un particolare ringraziamento va ad ogni relatore, e questa sera abbiamo due presenti, uno sarà oggi, uno sarà domani, che arrivano, uno dall'Australia, Clive Hamilton, che ringrazio, e Serge Latouche, che ringrazio di essere qui con noi. Ecco, li ringrazio tutti i relatori, non solo di essere qui con noi, ma soprattutto, e senza compenso, vi dico questo, ma di partecipare almeno a 3 dei 4 giorni del nostro convegno. Testimonianza questa di vero coinvolgimento partecipativo ad un'opera che solo insieme si può comporre. Dunque non le solite toccate e fughe da prima donna, ma un grande dono che chiamerei amore, un dono che crea un legame e a cui va tutta la mia, la nostra gratitudine. Una bella testimonianza di economia mistica. E prima di presentarvi i compagni che con me hanno curato questo convegno e che terranno via via i fili anche delle relazioni, ringrazio il piccolo villaggio che mi sono accorta c'è dietro a questo convegno. Sono circa una 50 di persone. Le ringrazio a tutte, a una, perché veramente sono appassionati. Prima di chiamare Gianni e Fulvio, chiamo il mio presidente di Fondazione Arbor, Domenico Piovesana, che ci dirà 2 parole e che ringraziamo veramente per tutto quello che questa fondazione fa nel mondo per promuovere e farci diventare dialogo interreligioso e interculturale. Ecco qua.
Grazie, dopo queste parole sono già in imbarazzo perché dopo un discorso di Patrizia è difficile avere delle parole altrettanto belle, altrettanto convincenti. Comunque in rappresentanza di Arbor volevo, intanto mi fa piacere di vedervi qui numerosi, tra l'altro qualcuno poi so che segue, anche tanti studenti seguiranno via stream, via web questo convegno. Io penso che l'argomento sia di sicuro interesse perché è di fronte a tutti la situazione di crisi attuale, per cui non c'è bisogno di spendere parole in questo senso. E volevo però prima di tutto ringraziare anch'io i partecipanti e in particolare i relatori di questo convegno che sono venuti, hanno accettato con entusiasmo di partecipare, anche venendo appunto da paesi lontani, e tra l'altro non per sottolineare gli aspetti economici, ma senza assoluto compenso. Quindi vi ringrazio gli attuali qui presenti e anche quelli che poi seguiranno. Ma mi occorre anche fare un ringraziamento ai veri organizzatori del convegno, che sono Patrizia Gioia, Gianni Vacchelli e Fulvio Manari in primis. Poi ci sono appunto addirittura un villaggio, come dice Patrizia, però ringrazio in particolare loro perché ci hanno messo non solo la mente ma anche il cuore, davvero, per il successo di questo convegno. E poi volevo dirvi che per quanto riguarda, per spendere 2 parole sull'oggetto del convegno, economia mistica, penso che da una prima lettura sembrerebbe quasi una provocazione abbinare l'economia alla mistica, sembra quasi in un certo senso un sacrilegio o comunque che siano 2 concetti assolutamente contrapposti. Viceversa, io penso che in ognuno di noi ci sia proprio l'uomo è uomo economico, perché ogni giorno dobbiamo risolvere i problemi quotidiani di sopravvivenza e di avere comunque certi determinati beni materiali, ma sicuramente c'è anche un uomo mistico in tutti noi, c'è anche la necessità di una ricerca di un oltre. E quindi anche se i 2 concetti, uno evoca l'economia, evoca il pragmatismo, appunto un calcolo economico, e sembra quindi contrapposto al misticismo che evoca invece una trascendenza, una ricerca spirituale, io penso proprio che queste 2 anime siano connaturate nell'uomo e che il problema non sia tanto questa contrapposizione ma un armonioso bilanciamento di entrambi, non far prevalere solo l'uomo economico che diventa se no scade nel materialismo, e probabilmente non si può neanche pensare di avere un uomo solo mistico, perché purtroppo ogni giorno dobbiamo anche risolvere i problemi pratici quotidiani. Per cui ringrazio ancora e adesso inizieremo con questo convegno che sicuramente penso dia degli spunti interessanti a tutti noi di riflessione e, come diceva appunto Patrizia, lo spirito è anche quello di avere un dialogo, perché nessuno ha la verità assoluta, nessuno pretende oggi e neanche nei prossimi giorni di dare delle risposte compiute, ma sicuramente ognuno può dare un contributo, anche lo studente, la persona più semplice, proprio per la sua esperienza può dare un contributo significativo. Un'altra cosa che mi è piaciuta è che, come avrete visto nella locandina, questo non è un convegno, diciamo, classico. Anche il convegno ha un tocco di misticismo, perché abbiamo degli intervalli musicali, abbiamo degli spettacoli teatrali alla serata, abbiamo delle esibizioni, anche un tocco di magia, avremo anche un speciale prestigiatore, per cui lo stesso convegno è, diciamo, improntato un po' a questo connubio, a cercare di contemperare l'aspetto diciamo materiale e anche l'aspetto inscindibile di gioco e di trascendenza che ognuno di noi ha. Bene, grazie.
Grazie Domenico, grazie. Bene, allora chiamiamo i nostri due folletti, una bella triade, Fulvio Manara e Gianni Vacchelli della comunità, io mi siedo qua, mettiti pure qui tu Fulvio, della comunità di ricerca di Bergamo, Colligite Fragmenta, che presenteranno un po' la filosofia di questo convegno.
Bene, ringrazio tutti per la vostra presenza, in particolare la Fondazione Arbor, Spazio Studio e tutti quelli che hanno cooperato. È un momento in cui noi crediamo molto, in cui abbiamo creduto molto e dal quale speriamo poi parta anche una pista di indagine e una pista di trasformazione profonda, perché non è tanto la certezza quello che andiamo cercando, ma quanto questa forza, un'energia che ci permetta di far passare un po' le parole nella realtà, far diventare le parole efficaci, far diventare le parole momento di esperienza trasformativa. Il convegno prende il titolo da un libro, dalla traduzione italiana del titolo di un libro che è uscito in originale in inglese in Australia e che è quello che abbiamo tradotto e pubblicato, è uscito in questi giorni, lo trovate anche in distribuzione, è L'Economista Mistico di Clive Hamilton, che è il primo relatore di questo nostro convegno, che ringraziamo per aver accettato tutta questa impresa con uno spirito di condivisione profondo. Abbiamo pensato che fosse il caso di ascoltare le parole di questo testo e di cominciare a interrogarci a partire dalle parole di questo testo, lasciando sorgere delle domande legittime, che sono le domande che non hanno ancora una risposta, sono le domande non retoriche, non accademiche, le domande reali che si saldano con le domande che nascono dalle inquietudini del nostro tempo di fronte alla crisi. Dicevo poco fa anche a Clive che il suo libro, uscito nel 94, ha oggi a leggerlo aspetti di enorme contemporaneità e quasi sembra, come dire, una voce profetica, intendendo la profezia nel senso forte, quella che richiama l'attenzione agli occhi aperti, al cuore aperto, al sentire aperto sul nostro presente, che ha bisogno probabilmente, come lui stesso propone nelle pagine del suo libro, di una trasformazione profonda, di una profonda metanoia, come diceva Raymond Panikkar, di una trasformazione anche dei punti di vista, delle visioni del mondo. Il problema, infatti, in primis, sono due le grandi questioni, tra tante domande che fanno sorgere, che il libro fa sorgere, sono due le più importanti, quelle su cui già da ora io richiamo un po' la vostra attenzione. La prima domanda è che esiste nel nostro mondo, nel mondo occidentale in particolare, un po' su tutto il pianeta, una pressione forte da parte di un'ideologia economicistica, che è quella che fa quello che diceva poco fa Domenico Piovesana, fa sì che ritiene che l'uomo economico sia l'unico fattore determinante dell'esperienza umana, e questo evidentemente è un rischio fatale. È come se dentro la ricerca economica, io penso non nelle facoltà di economia, perché sicuramente per esempio la presenza di Serge Latouche ce lo ricorda, un esimio economista che conosciamo per avere posizioni diverse rispetto a quelle dell'economicismo, forse non tanto dentro la ricerca economica, ma nella cultura economica diffusa nel senso comune nella nostra società e dentro le ideologie dei decisori politici. Sicuramente questa presenza dell'economicismo è forte, e l'economicismo significa proprio questo, cioè pensare che si possa ridurre l'esperienza umana o ricondurla al solo fattore dell'offerta e della domanda e del calcolo economico. E come ha ricordato anche Domenico poco fa, l'essere umano è molto più complesso. Le dimensioni dell'umano sono molte di più, c'è l'uomo che parla, l'uomo che gioca, l'uomo ludens, l'uomo che interpreta, l'uomo che crede, l'uomo religioso, sono tantissime le possibilità, l'uomo che sa creare, che sa co-creare dentro la natura. Quindi per, come dire, dare una provocazione anche nei confronti di quelli che si occupano professionalmente della ricerca economica, la nostra domanda è quella appunto di prendere sul serio i paradigmi da cui si parte quando si guarda alla scienza economica, quando si crea e si costruisce conoscenza economica. E dentro questo interrogarsi generale, un secondo punto è che il testo di Hamilton ci richiama con molta forza, è che la parola economia, voi sapete, è composta di due, viene dal greco, è composta di due termini, oikos e nomos, che vorrebbe un po' dire come l'ordine o la regola della casa. Oikos è la casa o l'ambiente, ma di quale casa si parla? Di quale casa si parla quando si pensa all'economia, quando si fa ricerca economica? Questa domanda non può essere cancellata radicalmente. Non può essere solo la casa umana, quindi giustamente negli ultimi 20 anni abbiamo visto crescere un interesse per l'etica economica fortissimo, che già apriva in direzione di una comprensione diversa della casa, dell'economico, che non è solo il sistema produttivo, ma è l'ambiente umano con tutte le sue dimensioni. Ma quella casa forse non può essere intesa in senso più ampio, più profondo? Non richiama forse l'attenzione che dobbiamo avere verso il creato, verso la natura, verso il cosmo? E non ci richiama forse ad altre dimensioni della casa che abitiamo nella realtà, che sono forse quelle poi a cui arriva l'esperienza mistica, che è la dimensione del divino, del mistero che attraversa tutta l'esperienza umana? Noi pensiamo che giustamente per comporre le possibilità dell'esperienza economica sia necessaria questa apertura e questo interrogarsi radicale, questo nuovo sentire nei confronti per esempio dell'ambiente, ed è un sentire, non solo un conoscere, è un aprirsi a una maniera di conoscere diversa, è una maniera di conoscere amorosa forse. Noi abbiamo, come dire, sentito queste domande e ve le riproponiamo insieme a Gianni Vacchelli, che appunto è membro della comunità di ricerca Cultura, Religione, Diritti non Violenza, no? che ha collaborato alla progettazione del convegno. Vi vogliamo presentare un po' questa rosa di questioni che noi abbiamo cercato di aprire. Quindi adesso lascio la parola subito a Gianni per completare il quadro della presentazione.
Grazie Fulvio, anch'io volevo, ma non solo formalmente, ma di mente e di cuore, ringraziarvi tutti, e ancora ringraziare Fondazione Arbor, Domenico Piovesana, Giovanna, senza i quali non avremmo potuto fare tutto questo, e naturalmente gli amici relatori e tutti voi. In effetti su questo convegno abbiamo lavorato tanto e meditato tanto e ruminato tanto anche, e c'è proprio dietro una filosofia, come va da sé che debba essere in un convegno di questo tipo. Alcuni punti ve li ha già sottolineati Fulvio e Patrizia ha già fatto cenni importanti all'inizio. Vorrei riprendere rapidamente alcune di queste domande e alcuni di questi punti che ci sembrano cruciali. Intanto l'abbiamo già sentito molto, la necessità di una trasformazione profonda, di una metanoia profonda. È come se il mitos attuale, che è il mitos della quantità e dello sviluppo, stia tramontando. E quindi in qualche modo siamo in una fase trasformativa straordinaria, che richiede appunto il fattore umano, il fattore cosmico e il fattore spirituale, in modo che interagiscano insieme. A noi sembra che questo convegno abbia anche una forte dimensione politica nel senso nobile della parola e ha una forte dimensione interiore. Potremmo dire che economia è l'aspetto pratico ed è l'aspetto esteriore e adesso non è disgiunto dall'aspetto interiore. I due non possono essere assolutamente separati e quindi ci sembra che questo convegno abbia l'ambizione di essere appunto politico, polis, di cittadinanza attiva e di risveglio anche, e appunto questi due aspetti sono troppo spesso scissi, sono troppo spesso come dire slegati tra di loro e troppo spesso forse si accetta, non certo noi qui adesso, si accetta che non può che essere così e invece la trasformazione avviene dentro e fuori di noi. Ci sembra anche che questo convegno abbia una valenza teoretica grande perché mette in comunicazione le discipline. È tipico un po' della nostra mente occidentale, occidentalista, l'economia sta da una parte, l'etica dall'altra, la teologia, la filosofia, non parliamo la mistica, e invece in qualche modo tutte queste discipline sono collegate tra di loro. È chiaro che se questo convegno fosse stato solo la spiritualità, andava tutti bene, va bene, un bel convegno sulla spiritualità. Il fatto che abbiamo unito economia e spiritualità ha destato grande entusiasmo in alcuni e invece anche grandi resistenze, perché toccando l'economico tocchiamo un mitos del nostro tempo, tocchiamo qualcosa che non va toccato sotto alcuni punti di vista e quindi questo è stato anche un'esperienza interessante, vedere tanto entusiasmo, tanta sete da questo punto di vista, ma anche vedere come, ma come si può parlare, come si può creare questo ossimoro dell'economista mistico. Evidentemente si può e forse si deve e questa è una delle, come dire, è una delle cose che stanno sotto questo convegno. Questo convegno incrocia infatti economisti, filosofi, teologi e teologhe, filosofi e filosofe, proprio per dialogare su questi temi con il pensiero di Raymond Panikkar, che è già stato citato, che è un pensiero di sottofondo, che sarà presente nel convegno, evidentemente nella relazione di Achille Rossi, ma che comunque è un pensiero che in qualche modo circola accanto a tutti questi e in dialogo con tutti questi. Termino sottolineandovi, come dire, 3 domande che ci portiamo assieme alle 2 che vi ha portato Fulvio. L'economia può avere una dimensione spirituale? È una domanda, ma forse è anche in parte una certezza. E la spiritualità qui è intesa naturalmente in senso universale e non confessionale, quel di più, quell'oltre che ciascuno di noi ha dentro di sé e sulle quali si fa domande, ricerca e si interpella. Evidentemente un'economia che riduce la realtà e gli esseri umani e i viventi tutti ad una cifra non ha futuro. E questo è un punto. Il secondo punto è che l'economia può trasformarsi interculturalmente, perché il modello che noi abbiamo davanti ai nostri occhi è un modello monoculturale. In fin dei conti è stato prodotto da noi e forse da un solo aspetto dell'Occidente. Ci sono tanti aspetti dell'Occidente e ci sono tante economie e tanti punti di vista sull'economico diversi. E oggi questo modello non solo fa soffrire tante altre zone del mondo, ma è in qualche modo un modello che non è più sufficiente neanche per la parte privilegiata del mondo. E quindi evidentemente questo ci dà parecchio da riflettere. Come accennavo prima, e concludo, il mito della quantità e dello sviluppo sta finendo. Il fatto che il nuovo mito non sia ancora del tutto chiaro e non sia pienamente emerso non deve frustrarci, ma soltanto moltiplicare i nostri sforzi, accendere le menti e i nostri cuori e andare verso questa grande trasformazione che stiamo vivendo. Buon convegno.
Bene, allora lasciamo le nostre postazioni io e Gianni e invitiamo il nostro ospite, primo ospite, Clive Hamilton, a venire. Grazie.
Grazie Clive per aver accettato di essere presente tra noi. Clive Hamilton è professore di etica applicata e di di etica pubblica al Centro per la filosofia applicata all'etica pubblica della Charles Sturt University in Australia, è membro del Consiglio della Commissione del Governo australiano per il cambiamento climatico e in passato ha diretto e fondato The Australia Institute. È l'autore del libro da cui abbiamo preso il titolo. Gli abbiamo lasciato ampio spazio per dire quello che vuole, sa bene che noi siamo interpellati da questo testo e quindi e anche ultimamente mi ha suggerito che su questa cosa, anche se sono passati parecchi anni da quando è uscito in Australia per la prima volta il libro, ha ruminato e pensato cose nuove, per cui noi ci aspettiamo oggi che ci comunichi queste sue riflessioni sulla scia del lavoro che ha fatto. La parola a Clive.
Many thanks. Well, let me first express my okay. Otherwise, I can use one of those if need be. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you, Fulvio. I'm very grateful for the invitation to come to this conference, and indeed the other conveners, Patricia and Gianni, for inviting me to this event, and indeed my thanks to the Arbor Foundation for supporting my visit to Milan. It's an honor to be invited to speak at this conference, not least because of the eminence of the other speakers we will hear from over the next days. It promises, I think, to be a fascinating conversation. Okay, so this conference has required me to revisit my book, The Mystic Economist, which was published 18 years ago. I have to confess that today I'm a little embarrassed about the title of the book. It was chosen because it is striking and memorable, but it also sounds a little self-indulgent. But we all have to bear the crosses of our youthful mistakes. I've had to ask myself, 18 years later, how much of the book still rings true for me. As you would expect, my ideas have evolved considerably, especially in more recent times, for reasons that I will explain. So the arguments that I'll present today, although perhaps challenging, are only preliminary, and I look forward to hearing your reactions to them. Now, much of the book is a social critique of late consumer capitalism. The analysis remains highly relevant today.
Si sente adesso? They have some problem because they couldn't hear. Don't hear.
Could get me a glass of water.
Ok. Funziona? Funziona? Ok. Sorry.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, that's channel 5, is it? Channel 5. Okay, everybody on the right channel.
Technology.
Yeah. I wish I could speak Italian, but there you go. So, much of the book is a social critique of late consumer capitalism, and of course the analysis remains highly relevant today. Indeed, developments since 1994, when the book was published, have reinforced its accuracy. The influence of a narrow kind of economic ideology, including the calculative consciousness and marketing environment that go with it, now pervade areas of social life from which they were once excluded. Universities, sports competitions, the non-profit sector, personal relationships. And this ideology has spread much further across the world, notably to China. Globalization has linked the world more closely in ways that have made us all the prisoners of financial markets. And it's done so to a degree that would have made us shudder in 1994, indeed, to a degree that makes us shudder today. The analysis of the social and psychological functions of consumerism appears to me to be more valid now than it was in 1994. In the early 1990s, the Western world was at the start of an extraordinary consumer boom, fueled by debt and ever-escalating desire, which resulted inevitably in the financial crash of 2008. It's hard to explain this mania for stuff, this affluenza, without taking the view that consumption has become a substitute for something else, something that could never be satisfied by consumption. The yearnings that are repeatedly disappointed by consumerism's broken promises have spilled out in other ways, in the diseases of affluence, addictions, depression, narcissism. The 1990s was the era of the rise of brands, a new and distinct stage of consumerism that superseded the old notion of keeping up with the Joneses. We witnessed a shift to the cultural practice of creating a personal identity through the brands one aligns oneself with. And childhood has become completely colonized by marketing. So I think the book goes some way to explaining the great paradox of the modern world. The paradox is that despite high and sustained levels of economic growth in the West over a period of 50 years or so, growth that saw average real incomes increase several times over, despite that, the mass of people are no more satisfied with their lives than they were then. All of the evidence shows that. And that was true before the crash of 2008, from which many people are still trying to recover. In The Mystic Economist, I have much to say about money and its promise of immortality as a means of transcending insignificance. The anthropological evidence for this sacred power of money is strong. Yet, to foreshadow my critique, now I would question the attempt to link the power of money to some kind of sublimated sacred power. Instead, I think we have to accept that the secularization of money and exchange was a real occurrence. Although I think it's true that the power of money still lies in its promise to allow the owner to transcend everyday life, I don't believe that it can be regarded any longer as I described it in the book, as the metamorphosis of the sacred. Underpinning the book's social critique, which, as I say, remains just as valid, is an understanding of the nature of the world and of humans that I now question. It's an ontology that draws on the Eastern notion of duality and the belief that our essential task is to dig down below our everyday selves to uncover our true selves. I'll explain later in the lecture the personal event that led me to adopt that ontological view, the view that imbues the Mystic Economist. So in recent years, my views have been shifting quite radically, and they've done so after an extended period studying climate change and its implications for the future of the Earth and of humanity. The link between climate change and the most fundamental way we understand the world is not immediately obvious. So let me explain. In short, I now see the world as having entered a wholly new historical epoch, one that requires us to rethink everything. Much of the mystic economist is devoted to describing how the emergence of the modern subject, that is, our sense of ourselves as an isolated ego existing inside a body, and the parallel disenchantment of nature, how the modern subject, this new idea, which came about in the Enlightenment, how that has reframed our relationship with the natural world in a way that is destructive. The role of free market economics has been to provide a justification for that destructive attitude by objectifying the world as a catalogue of resources amenable to instrumental calculation. And I think all of that critique remains valid. Indeed, the destructiveness is much worse than we imagined it could be. Now, under optimistic assumptions about how and when the major nations of the world will respond to rising levels of greenhouse gas emissions, the Earth is expected to warm by 4 degrees centigrade or more by the end of the century, rendering the planet hotter than it has been for 15 million years. That amount of warming will transform the conditions in which advanced life forms emerged. Even rather conservative bodies like the International Energy Agency have reached this conclusion. And military strategists are beginning to factor into their planning a world under serious climatic stress. Limiting warming to 2 degrees, the official European Union and G8 target, is now impossible. Yet even that level of warming will trigger changes to the global climate system that will persist for many centuries. The globe is warming because modern humans are digging up and burning fossilized carbon that was stored safely under layers of rock for millions of years. Shifting carbon from under the ground into the atmosphere changes the atmosphere's chemical composition. And this, as we know, is both warming the globe and changing the climate. However, and this fact has not sunk into popular consciousness, it's not only the atmosphere that is in play. All components of the Earth system are affected. Around the world, rainfall patterns are beginning to change. Ice masses are melting. Habitats are shifting. And species are disappearing. The oceans are warming and becoming more acidic as we pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so in watching that opening video with David Attenborough, behind the astonishing beauty of the images we saw lies a great tragedy. Perhaps most remarkably, geoscientists are now discovering that human activity above ground is influencing what is happening below ground in the lithosphere, or the Earth's crust. So, for example, melting ice masses can cause the ground beneath to rebound. With a decline in ice masses, with a decline in the ice load on Greenland, for example, of 1 kilometre, and ice masses are sometimes 2 or 3 kilometres thick, if the ice declines by 1 kilometre, then the crust of the Earth may rebound by hundreds of metres, triggering seismic instability and earthquakes. And new research by geophysicists suggests that rising sea levels, and I find this quite astonishing, may be responsible for influencing the amount of volcanic activity in the world. Of course, human impacts go much further than climate disruption. Let me remind you of just 2 salient facts. The oceans now contain so much plastic waste that oceanographers have taken to describing them as a plastic soup. And each year, the amount of soil and rock moved around the Earth's surface by human activity exceeds the amount moved by natural weathering. So not only has most of the Earth's land surface been turned over to human use, but every cubic metre of air and ocean has been modified by industrial or agricultural activity. The essential point is that human impact on the natural world has gone beyond a patchwork of local damage confined to particular areas of the globe. The Earth as a whole is being reorganised. The dynamics of the atmosphere, soils, vegetation, oceans, ice masses, and geological formations have been deflected from their natural patterns of change so that the Earth's complex systems have been thrown out of kilter. All of these events converge in the recent announcement by scientists that the Earth has entered into a new epoch in its geological history, an epoch known as the Anthropocene, or Age of Humans. The principal factors behind the arrival of the Anthropocene are human-induced climate change and explosive population growth. The new geological epoch is defined by the fact that, in the words of leading Earth scientists, the human imprint on the global environment has now become so large and active that it rivals some of the great forces of nature in its impact on the functioning of the Earth system. The new epoch of the Anthropocene comes at the end of a brief but remarkable period in the climate history of the Earth, a 10,000-year interlude of unusually mild and equable climate. This interlude, the last 10,000 years, is known as the Holocene, and it followed millions of years of wild climatic swings. If you look at the chart, for the last several million years, you'll see dramatic swings in the Earth's climate, and then 10,000 years ago, it suddenly stabilized and just moved like that, very small changes. This stabilization of the Earth's climate in the Holocene permitted civilization to flourish. Settled agriculture became possible because regular floods followed the development of irrigation in the area we now know as the cradle of civilization, the river valleys that drain into the Persian Gulf. These new conditions permitted the development of the wheel, writing, mathematics, legal codes, centralized government, and social strata. It's for this reason that we can talk of the halcyon millennia of the Holocene. But that era has now come to an end. In the sympathetic environment of the Holocene, humankind thrived so successfully that we shifted the Earth's geological trajectory. We have entered a new epoch of climatic instability, the Anthropocene. The paramount fact about climate change, which separates it from all other environmental threats, is that carbon dioxide persists in the atmosphere for thousands of years. If human activity occurring over a century or two can irreversibly transform the global climate for millennia, we are prompted to rethink the place of humankind in the arc of history. I believe that the advent of the Anthropocene must cause us to stop and rethink everything. Previously, we imagined the human drama to be a play that took place on an inert and passive stage called the Earth. But now we're waking up to the fact that the Earth has entered into the play as a powerful and unpredictable force. Indeed, it now seems to be writing the script for the last acts of the drama. The inert stage of human history we used to call the environment, the non-human space over there. But this environment no longer exists. In its place, we now have the Earth system, a collection of interdependent spheres that make up the planet. The hydrosphere, the watery parts, the geosphere, the Earth's crust and what lies beneath, the biosphere, living things, and the atmosphere, the air. The new science of Earth systems, which is not much more than a decade old and was stimulated by Gaia theory, conceives of these spheres as intimately connected, linked by a number of planetary processes, like the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the water cycle. And to this standard list of spheres, we might separate humans from the biosphere to form what might be called the anthroposphere. After all, the possession of consciousness, the exercise of agency, and the power of technology divide humans radically from other living things. If humans have not merely transformed the landscape, but have imprinted themselves on every cubic metre of air and water, each year the Earth becomes more and more a human artefact. The vital shift we must make is to understand the Earth system as a single, self-regulating system with physical, chemical, biological and human components. Humans are not merely dependent on the Earth for their survival in the way all creatures are. We are a powerful element of the system with the capacity to shift its course. Indeed, we already have shifted its course. While we always regarded the Earth stage as just there, a pre-existing environment on which we could carry out our plans, now it seems more meaningful to think of the Earth as making itself available to us so that we could flourish. The wild gyrations of climate were calmed in the Holocene to provide a brief opening for us to build civilizations and reach an advanced technological state. But those conditions were never guaranteed, and it was always possible that overconfident humans in possession of great technological powers could trigger a return to the chaotic and hostile climate that characterized most of the planet's history. Until recently, I would have interpreted these developments as a sign that human beings had taken a seriously wrong turn, and that the roots of this mistake can be found somewhere in the philosophical cultural shifts sparked by the European Enlightenment and the subsequent scientific and industrial revolutions. As in the Mystic Economist, I would have stressed our narrow rationality, our alienation from nature, and the way we'd lost touch with something essential to our humanity. Implicit in the Mystic Economist's critique of the Enlightenment is the sense that for all of its undoubted material benefits, there was an essential flaw in it, because it's taken us away from our true selves, that is, a kind of uncorrupted self that is closer to nature. So the book's primary argument is that if we can discover our true selves between the accumulated layers of excessive rationality, individualism, and consumerism, then we will be able to live fulfilled lives and find our way back to a healthy relationship with the natural world and with each other. This critique is essentially a romantic one. It pines for an earlier age in which humans, despite the poverty, disease, superstition, and oppression, nevertheless lived in some sense more authentically. The political implication is that in the modern world, we can separate the wheat from the chaff so that we can keep the good things, material comforts, modern medicine, political liberties, personal freedoms, and discard the bad ones, excessive individualism, alienation, and environmental exploitation. I now suspect that this point of view rests on a conception of history that unwittingly accepts the essential presumption of the Enlightenment itself, that the world is, in a relevant sense, solely a human creation, arisen from the acts of men and women. In this view, changes in the natural world go on behind history. Earth history evolves in ways internal to itself and of no immediate concern to us. This splitting of human history from Earth history was an essential moment in the evolution of the modern subject, that is, the rational, self-determining individual. The modern idea of human history was perhaps first defined in the 19th century by Jacob Burckhardt, who wrote that history is the break with nature caused by the awakening of consciousness. The awakening of consciousness is often traced to Renaissance Italy. In his book, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, first published in 1860, Jacob Burckhardt wrote, "In the Middle Ages, both sides of human consciousness, that which was turned within as that which was turned without, lay dreaming or half awake beneath a common veil. In Italy, during the Renaissance, this veil first melted into air, and an objective treatment of all the things of this world became possible. The subjective side, at the same time, asserted itself with corresponding emphasis." Some of the most striking paintings that mirrored the awakening of what we now understand as the modern individual by 15th and 16th century masters, such as Bellini, Raphael, Titian, and Moroni, can be found not far from here in the Accademia Carrara in Bergamo. The major pieces in that exhibition recently were shown at the National Gallery of Australia, just across the road from where I work, so I spent a lot of time looking at them. So, my critique of the Enlightenment was itself steeped in the Enlightenment conception of history as a purely human creation, as if we could go back to an earlier era to retrieve what is of value. In such a view, there can be no higher destiny or larger process unfolding within which the awakening of modern consciousness took its place. The arrival of the age of the Anthropocene and our inability to come to grips with it suggests to me that we are as much at the mercy of history as we are the creators of it. The advent of the Anthropocene and the climate crisis are disclosing something new and fundamental about humans and their evolution. Taking a meta-historical standpoint, we can see the Anthropocene, like the Enlightenment, as not merely an event that happens to humans and transforms them, nor as an age that humans brought about. Indeed, we are drawn to see the Anthropocene as a new form of disclosure of being, as a new epoch of truth in which the secular goal of human perfectibility must be relinquished and the technological will to power must be transcended in one way or another. Neither introspection nor a return to old ways of thinking can provide the answers we need in a newly emerging state of being. What the situation calls for is a clear-eyed gaze at the hardness of the future, the one actually unfolding before us, at the transformation of the earth itself. I'm suggesting that we are caught in the transition to a new epoch, not merely a geological one, but a shift in the nature of existence itself. Although I've been moving towards this kind of planetary historical thinking for a few years, my thoughts have been crystallized much more recently by reading the works of the Christian theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, particularly his letters and papers from prison, which he penned in the year or so before he was executed in April 1945 for his part in the plot that killed Hitler. Although always professing his deep faith in Christ, Bonhoeffer argued for what he called a religionless Christianity. He was dismissive of the Church's attempts to save religion from the relentless march of secularization by seeking out refuges for God in whatever aspects of life and the universe modern science could not explain. Instead of seeing the Enlightenment and the subsequent death of God as something to be lamented and resisted, Bonhoeffer saw it as humankind's coming of age. As humankind's coming of age. By religion, Bonhoeffer meant, when he was talking about religionless Christianity, by religion, Bonhoeffer meant the kind of human activity that looked beyond the world for answers or for salvation, towards the metaphysical God of the Deus ex machina, the God of miracles and supernatural intervention, to which the churches claimed still to have access. Instead of a religion of piety, which he saw as self-absorbed inwardness, he cast his lot with a Christianity that remained always in the world. In the world come of age, after the Enlightenment, when the world came of age, where science, technology and organisation have taken over from divine and natural forces, religion has been superseded. It's no longer necessary, he argued, to hold on to God as a working hypothesis to explain those things we cannot understand or influence. In the last 2 or 3 centuries, most things in life have come under human control, said Bonhoeffer. And ordinary men and women go about their lives without the need for a metaphysical God. The resistance of the church to the adulthood of the world is pointless, he argued, because it attempts to, as he wrote, put a grown-up man back into adolescence, that is, back into a state of dependence. In the idea of the world come of age, Bonhoeffer was echoing Immanuel Kant's vision of the Enlightenment as the human being's emergence from his self-incurred minority, a maturation he saw inscribed in humankind's destiny. Rather than declaring, like Kant, the triumph of reason over superstition, Bonhoeffer emphasised the responsibility that humankind had to accept for itself and for the natural world. This newfound responsibility is exercised through the application of science and technology and the political and personal freedoms that emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries. These are the means by which we could develop a new relationship with the world, to take control of nature and shape it. In the exercise of these powers of modern humans, God and the churches have no role to play. Bonhoeffer accepted secularization because it promised the opportunity for humankind to grow to its full potential, to develop our faculties, and thereby to become fully human. Yet freedom in the post-religious age carried with it a great burden, the realization that the well-being of others lay in our hands rather than in the hands of God or Providence. Quote, "Thus the autonomy of the world come of age," wrote Bonhoeffer's biographer, "the autonomy of the world come of age is not to be understood as the freedom of the Titan, but rather the freedom born of humility." The implication is that humanism, including various religious humanisms, humanism was the necessary expression in the world of ideas and political practice of man coming of age. For Bonhoeffer himself, personally, while God is no longer needed as a guide to daily life, Christ is ever present in the relationships between people. Instead of being a victory won by humankind over the powers of superstition, the freedom man acquired in the Enlightenment, the shift of power from the divine realm to the earthly realm, that shift was the gift of God. In a challenge to people like some of us gathered here today, perhaps like me, not Christians, but nevertheless preoccupied with questions of meaning, Bonhoeffer is unwilling even to concede that religion and spiritual striving retain a role in providing answers to the ultimate questions. The secular answers to the questions of death, suffering, and guilt seem just as effective. Besides, the ordinary man has, as he wrote, neither the time nor the inclination to concern himself with his existential despair. He wrote that in one of his more important letters from prison on the 8th of June 1944. God wants us to realise his presence not in unsolved problems, but in those that are solved, he had written a few days earlier. Religion and the churches once concerned themselves with man's inner life, taking care of his soul. In the world come of age, the role of caring for man's soul was taken away from the churches and, for those still interested, given over to existential philosophy and psychotherapy. Perhaps no modern practice is more directly aimed at the care of the human soul than Jungian psychotherapy. References to Jungian ideas are, of course, scattered through the Mystic Economist. I make much in the book of the power of symbols and myths as a means of gaining access to the darker reaches of the collective unconscious, which is understood as the repository of the deeper truths that we need to rediscover. The idea is that these symbols and archetypes are the links with the other world, the one modern society has repudiated. If there is a central theme running through the Mystic Economist, it is that unlocking these deeper chambers of the self can release the stranglehold of the rational mind and instrumental thinking. One of my favourite lines from Jung, which I quote in the book, goes as follows. It must be admitted that the archetypal contents of the collective unconscious can often assume grotesque and horrible forms in dreams and fantasies, so that even the most hard-boiled rationalist is not immune from shattering nightmares and haunting fears. And when Jung was asked which people he found most difficult to heal, he answered unhesitatingly, habitual liars and intellectuals. Now, that's us. Well, I have to confess that I now have doubts about all of this. As Bonhoeffer comments sardonically, existential philosophy and psychotherapy are of interest only to intellectuals preoccupied with their inner selves at the expense of the world outside. I'm now, at times at least, inclined to agree. I do so in part because I wonder how much Jungian depth psychology has ever achieved, but more so because I question the basis on which archaic contents are thought to have therapeutic value. In the book I write that the deepest structures of the psyches are the oldest, which I think is still true. What I now question is whether those deepest structures contain any psychic gold, the material to build a bridge between the everyday world and the numinous world of truth and authenticity. I wonder whether what we're dredging up are archaic materials that we have properly left behind in a world come of age, and that attempting to revive them can only be an obstacle to further maturation. Bonhoeffer didn't live long enough to reflect on what might happen after the world had come of age. Responsibility requires the freedom to act and the power to act. But it also requires the inclination to act according to principle. We can immediately see the dilemma. If the withdrawal of God from the world was enough to give humanity the freedom to act, and science and industry gave us the power, where can we find the principles to ensure that we act responsibly, benevolently? After all, before we came of age, we looked to God, or at least the divine texts, for moral guidance. Yet I think we now have to confront a most difficult truth. Bonhoeffer's Christian ethics were not strong enough to survive the death of God, and Kant's categorical imperative, the notion of morality lying in duty, could never provide a motive to act in the common interests of humanity, let alone the interests of the earth. So the Enlightenment ceded us the freedom and the power to take control of the world, but left us no principles by which we could exercise our powers responsibly. And now, with the arrival of the Anthropocene, we're beginning to pay for it. Before I bring these ideas to a conclusion, let me mention an event in my own life that had a defining influence on the thinking expressed in the Mystic Economist, because the deeper ideas in the book sprang not so much from observing the external world, but from this personal event. And since the recent shift in my thinking also reflects a reinterpretation of that event, let me describe briefly what happened. In 1989, I had what is best called a profound religious experience. It came completely out of the blue. I wasn't seeking it and had no comprehension of what it was or what it meant. It was if I'd been strolling down the road one fine day when a giant hand came out of nowhere and grabbed me, and that hand took me up into the sky and shook me up and then sent me on a lightning-fast trip around the universe, threw me into the middle of a tornado, dunked me into the depths of the ocean, and then cast me up on a beach somewhere. The world I returned to was nothing like the world I'd left. I had, up until that day, been a confirmed atheist, so it was one of those kind of cosmic jokes that sometimes are played. Yet there was here was an empirical event that made it impossible to continue to believe that the world was no more than it appeared to be to our everyday senses and understanding. I was forced to admit that I had been skating along the surface of the world, and that there was another world of overwhelming power in which all individuality is obliterated and the intellect is wholly dissolved. It took me 6 years to recover from this earthquake and the handful of aftershocks that followed it. Those years I spent seeking a way to understand intellectually the truth of what had happened to me physically. In the Mystic Economist, it's apparent where I went. Carl Jung, Western mythology, Christian mysticism, and Eastern philosophy, each of which provided some validation and explanation for the kind of experience I'd had. Such experiences are beyond all rational explanation, but these traditions provided a context in which they could be understood and some clues to the meaning of them. They also exude the tantalizing sense that there is an esoteric knowledge that holds the key to the other world, and indeed this one. I was drawn to the Jungian idea of individuation, the process of achieving psychic wholeness by bringing unconscious material to the surface. Unlike his mentor, Freud, Jung was not interested in repressed sexual material and traumatic childhood experiences, but in the deeper structures of the unconscious laid down in archaic times, archetypes, which Jung believed guide our everyday actions whether we know it or not. I spent years reading Jung's arcane and fascinating works. I learnt about a great many things, and it enriched my understanding of humanity enormously. I discovered a small community of other introverts looking for answers in hermetic wisdom, although I'm not sure it made any difference to my psychic integration, whatever that might mean. Although the impact of these events and the knowledge that there is another universe of indescribable power lurking just behind the everyday world, although the impact of that event receded into the background, it continued to provide the backdrop to all my subsequent work. All of this, including the book, The Mystic Economist, was built on a belief that I had been permitted a rare glimpse into the other world of transcendent power, a truth and a force that dwarfs everything else in the mundane world. Yet, although there was no denying the overwhelming nature of the dimension in which I had fleetingly been immersed, I have now begun to wonder whether what I experienced was a kind of historical anomaly or anachronism. Perhaps it was not a special insight into a mysterious force at work today, but an eruption of the past into the present. A brief retreat to a world that was enchanted and numinous, but which has been superseded in the world come of age. Perhaps instead of being liberated by a vision of a deeper truth, I had become fixated on an archaic truth that is an obstacle to seeing the future, so that I'm less able to see how the nature of existence is unfolding in the Anthropocene. Perhaps my task is not to understand and intellectualise out of the experience, but to transcend it. Now, it's possible that in distancing myself from that event, I'm acting out that old Zen exhortation. I'm sure you've read that, that claim. If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. This is a hard truth to face up to. But if it is a truth, it calls for a rejection of all ontologies of inner truth, including the two worlds ontology that motivated the argument of the mystic economist. If so, when Carl Jung says that the key to psychological integration lies in bringing to the surface the contents of the collective unconscious laid down in archaic times, then following his path may actually be a regression to a pre-enlightenment consciousness rather than a liberation. Now, just writing down and speaking these thoughts for the first time to you today feels somehow like ingratitude, almost blasphemy. Yet I can't help feeling, as I peer into the Anthropocene stretching out before us, that the way I came to interpret my sudden immersion in that surging force dragged me back to an era before the world came of age instead of releasing me into the one beyond it. So let me conclude in the last 5 minutes by drawing together all of these strands. In The Mystic Economist, I frequently write about the sacredness of nature and the way in which our instrumental thinking has alienated us from the natural world. I argue that we possess a wilderness within that corresponds in some sense to the wilderness without, a structure laid down over millennia of pre-agricultural living. The destruction of the natural world therefore causes a profound psychological loss, and it's to restore some semblance of this ancient conception of nature that the modern environment movement exists. In the book, I draw on native attitudes to land and Jungian notions of the collective unconscious to argue that the deepest structures of our psyches were laid down in archaic times when we lived close to nature, and that if we can excavate those inner reaches, then we will rediscover our oneness with nature. Now I question all of this. The argument about recovering a oneness with the natural world assumes that the nature with which we might rejoin still exists. But this assumption must resist two serious challenges, one metaphysical and one physical. If we abandon our yearning for a past that has been superseded and accept that with the Enlightenment the world came of age, then the desacralisation of nature was not a regrettable side effect, but essential to the very same epical shift in the ontological history of the earth. The reassertion of the divine unity that I argued is environmentalism's goal cannot occur. We cannot reassert that divine unity because the divine in nature has withdrawn. I don't want to suggest that we're left with nothing more than a dead earth defined by Cartesian space. But I will here set aside the question of what might lie between an enchanted earth and a Cartesian earth. But as for the physical reason why the argument of, that we cannot recover oneness with the natural world, the physical reason is, of course, that nature itself has been transformed fundamentally by the Anthropocene. As we saw, science is now telling us that what we used to think of as the environment no longer exists. It's been replaced with the Earth system, an Earth system in which the imprint of human activity is detectable everywhere, in every cubic metre of earth, air and ocean. The deep interpenetration of human activity and Earth system processes means that all ideas of untouched nature collapse. There are, of course, some places that are much more natural than others, and we saw those wonderful images of the David Attenborough's film, where the human imprint is much lighter and not obvious to the untrained eye. But the idea that there are large expanses of a pristine world where we can go to rediscover our psychic depths is now lost. So the disenchantment of nature was not necessarily a leap to its total objectification. It was a test of our ability to forge a new relationship with the earth, built on our freedom and growing technological power, which would be mutually sustaining. Our task was not to preserve the earth unchanged, but to transform it responsibly. We may have been ripped from all that once gave life meaning, but the only answer was to find new meaning in an era of separation. In the world come of age, it is not our split from nature that must be resisted, but our violence against nature. So here humanity stands, at the point of transition between two geological epochs, one provided by nature to allow us to flourish, and the other created by us that threatens to undo civilization. The question that now haunts the universe is whether, in giving humans free will, the universe made a colossal mistake. So let me finish in the last minute or two with some even more speculative thoughts. Bonhoeffer urged us to accept the truth of Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead. He anointed the post-Enlightenment era as the time of religionless Christianity, arguing that the world of modernity, of scientific reason, of technology, and a self-determining individual, that this world of modernity represented humanity reaching maturity and taking responsibility for the earth. It's a powerful story, one that for Christians like Bonhoeffer allows a distinction between the secularization of the world and secularism. Yet, from Bonhoeffer's reflections, we can gain no clue as to what happens next. It seems to me that the arrival of the Anthropocene signals a moment when the history of the world is opened up. Are we to decide to press on doggedly with more of the same? More technological mastery, more exploitation of nature, more disenchantment, more nihilism. Needless to say, this is the path of denial, in which the future is imagined to be merely an enlarged version of the present, now an impossible vision. Or will people emerge, will we find emerging people who embody another future, who allow themselves to be appropriated by the next future, who are willing to think eschatologically, that is, to think the end of the world as object, the end of the techno-scientific appropriation of the world. When Nietzsche announced the death of the old God, he asked, you remember in that famous, when the madman ran into the public square, he asked the anguished question, who will wipe the blood off us? But perhaps there was no crime. The gods were not killed, but simply withdrew, opening to us the opportunity to create the future. The question is whether the gods will return, now that we've made a mess of it. As we stare into the Anthropocene, we do not know our fate. It lies over the horizon. Perhaps there are new gods waiting there, strange gods whose plans for us we can only guess. Thank you.
Bene, facciamo un attimo di pausa. Abbiamo un quarto d'ora, una pausa e poi riprendiamo per il dialogo sulla relazione di Clive. Grazie.
We're going to take a break.
Why?
Are we